The date was March 23rd, 1944. And in the skies over Germany, a squadron of American pilots were on a bombing mission to Brunswick. Now, this is a large city that had several artillery factories, explaining why it was bombed so often. And among this squadron was a number 2 wingman. He was flying a legendary fighter plane, a P-51 Mustang, when 2 enemy planes appeared. It was the Nazis in their Me-109 Messerschmitts. The adrenaline rushed, and the Americans sprung into action. The lead lieutenant, he pursued one of the enemy planes, and he shot it down. But the other Nazi plane evaded his fire. And in all of this chaos, they lost sight of that number 2 wingman. And so they radioed him. "We can't see you. Can you see us?" "No," he replied. "Where are you?" "We're circling at 15,000 feet. Pull up, come back." Silence. "Do you copy?" Silence. Meanwhile, a 16-year-old girl is walking down a country road outside a small German village when 2 planes appeared out of nowhere, a P-51 Mustang and an Me-109 Messerschmitt. And she ducked for cover beneath an apple tree, and she watched. The Nazi plane pursued the American, and then the American was in pursuit, bullets streaking through the air, striking the Nazi plane. And with smoke billowing, it barreled nose first into the ground, followed by a massive explosion. The Americans shot him down. But something was wrong. The P-51, it also started falling through the sky and passing through clouds and tumbling down like an injured bird. And the girl's eyes watched. When suddenly another figure appeared in the sky, it was the pilot. He had bailed from his plane, and he opened his parachute, and it began unfurling. But it was too late. He was already too close to the ground, and it didn't open in time. And the girl watched as he plunged to his death. Nearly 80 years later, my mother recalls this story, and she tells me how she saw that young man die that day. She was that 16-year-old girl, and as she told me this story, she was taken back to one of the darkest chapters in history. And that's just one of the stories my mom told me of her life growing up in Nazi Germany. And you can see why I wanted to write a book about her life, because there are many, many more that are just as remarkable. My mom represents an often untold perspective of World War II. The German perspective, and I admit, it's not always a popular perspective. And that's because we as humans can tend to put entire people groups into a box, and then we want a label on that box. Not that long ago, many in our own nation labeled all Muslims as terrorists. And I, and maybe many of you, have experienced this in reverse as Christians. Well, if you're a Christian, well, then you must be judgmental and you must be a hypocrite, right? And during and after World War II, nearly everyone labeled all Germans as Nazis. But that wasn't the case. Today, more than ever, we need to guard our hearts against condemning those people. The most famous verse in the Bible speaks to this. "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. When my mom shared her memories with me, it pulled back the curtain on what it was like to live through war and under Hitler's rule, under his thumb. The hunger, the bombings, the fear of being called out for not being patriotic enough, obedient enough, German enough. And there were many times when she was subjected to forced allegiance and outright cruelty. But she stood up for what was right, and she almost paid the ultimate price for it. Most of us are unaware of the oppression that the Nazis inflicted on many of their own people. My mother's story is a testament to that, and I share it in no way to diminish the suffering inflicted on the Jews and other people groups. Not at all. What it does is it just adds yet another layer of the enormity of the suffering of war and the consequences of allowing a madman to come into power. My mother had an unusual first name by today's standards. Her name was Waltraud. In German, it would be pronounced Waltraud. But it was a very common name for German girls at the time. It means strength, and she lived up to it. It also means stubborn. Oh yeah, she lived up to that too. I finally got to finish that book about a year ago, and I named it after her, Waltraud. Now, she knew I was working on her story, but my biggest regret is that she never got to read it or to see all that's happened as a result. You see, my mom passed away a little more than 4 years ago. And I know time has passed. And the ache in my soul, it isn't quite as crushing as it was early on. I can talk about her now without breaking down every time. But you never get over losing your mom, especially when she was as extraordinary as mine. You may ask how my mom knew some of the details from the story I shared about the planes, about the American pilots, about the types of planes, the radio contact back and forth, the squadron. She didn't. You see, after I published the book last year, there was a prodding in my soul to find certain people whose lives crossed paths with my mom's. And something inside me said, you need to find that young man who fell from the sky. And so I began my search through military archives and memorial sites. And what helped is that my mom and her family lived in a tiny, tiny village in northern Germany called Amtleben. It was located about 25 kilometers from Brunswick. It was so small that it had one telephone, one restaurant, one grocery store, one guest house, and one hardware store. And they were all in the same building. Tiny. And so I thought, how many American planes or pilots would have gone down next to this tiny little town? And as I searched the archives for the name of that town, there was one. And there was a name and a photo. James Asbury Scarborough. He grew up in Dublin, Georgia, and he was going to college to become a chemistry teacher when he felt the calling to enlist. He wasn't drafted. He wanted to make a difference in the war effort. He had reached the ripe old age of 21. It was his first flying mission and his last. I kept searching, and I found more details. I found his parents' names, Ambrose and Lolly. His siblings, Donald and Mary Faith. And I thought, well, maybe one of them could still be alive. And so I searched some more, only to find their obituaries. But in Mary Faith's obituary was listed a daughter, Catherine. And I thought, well, maybe I could find this Catherine. And so I went to the most powerful people search engine on the planet, Facebook. And there was one. And with trepidation, I sent a message to a complete stranger, something along the lines of, "You don't know me, this might be upsetting or weird, but if your uncle was James Scarborough, I have information about his death during World War II. If this is you and you're interested, please let me know. Send." And I didn't know. I didn't. Even if it was her, would she care about a long-lost relative whom she never met, whom she never knew? Did her family even talk about him anymore? Did they ever speak his name? But a few minutes later, ding, yes, yes. Tell me everything you know. Our family has wondered for 80 years what really happened to him. And so I told her what I knew. Catherine and I started as strangers, and we quickly became friends. She doesn't call him James. She calls him Uncle Jimmy. And from what she shared, he was pretty remarkable himself. She said that Jimmy's mother, her grandmother, never got over losing her son. She even believed for a while that it wasn't true, that he really didn't die, until after the war, when the Americans dug up his body near that tiny, tiny town, and they had it placed in a memorial cemetery along with other fallen soldiers. Out of all his living relatives, Catherine is the one who has all of his personal effects from the war. She's the one who wrote to the Veterans Affairs Office seeking more information on his death with no answers. She's the one who went with her mother to commemorate Jimmy at a memorial site to make sure his name was on the wall and that he wasn't forgotten. She has always felt a deep, deep connection to Uncle Jimmy. She even named her son after him. So to find her felt more than a miracle. This was a divine appointment. She didn't know that Jimmy jumped from his plane, that he plunged to his death, that he almost made it. She didn't know he was in an aerial dogfight. She didn't know he shot down an enemy plane. No one did. Not her family, not his squadron, not the U.S. military, no one but my mom. And in the military, that's a big deal. And so now she's looking into having him posthumously honored for having shot down the enemy. But to do that, you need an eyewitness account. And unfortunately, a passage in a book is not enough. But guess who has an audio recording of her mother telling that story? But even if that does not happen, even if, the closure and the healing that this has brought to one family has been remarkable. For 80 years, they thought he didn't fulfill his calling, that he died in vain, having gone down on his first mission, never making a difference in the war effort after all. Oh, but he did. And why am I telling you this? None of this would have happened if not for my mother's willingness to share her story, as haunting as her past was. And so my message to you today is to tell your story. Tell your story. You have no idea whose life on the other side could change as a result. The healing that you could bring to somebody else. My mom experienced things more horrific than this. Things no human being, let alone a teenage girl, should ever have to witness. But she didn't hold it inside. She told her story. And telling it made her stronger. Telling it made her victorious over the suffering. She didn't allow the horrors of her past to define her. She defined them. She named them, and she was victorious over them, and they no longer had power over her. And I am sure that there are those here who, maybe like my mom, have experienced heartache of another kind, suffering. Those who have carried a secret burden for years. It's tucked in there. And you think that if I let it out, the pain, it'll be too much. It will make it all real again. It will consume me again. It will unleash something that can't be stuffed back inside. Or maybe it's shame that's holding you back. Maybe the burden you hold inside is a result of suffering you've caused to others. And so you keep it a secret. You hide it away, thinking releasing it, it's going to somehow cause more damage than good. It's our way of trying to stay in control. But the truth is, the secret is controlling you. It's holding you back. It's not allowing you to move on, not allowing you to heal, and not allowing others around you to heal. If we don't do the work to address our past, it is still our present. And it will show up and it will impact every part of our lives, especially our relationships. Or maybe you're just waiting. You're waiting for God to take that burden from you. Maybe you have prayed and prayed and prayed like King David in the Psalms. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. In other words, God, please take this burden from me. It's easy to pray that prayer and wonder why God doesn't just magically deliver, to renew our spirit and to free us from our past and our sin. But we have a tendency to sometimes pluck a verse from the Bible, and then we declare it with confidence, and then we wonder why things don't change. But there's more to that psalm than just that verse. The psalmist, he also talks about a sacrifice of a broken spirit, a willing spirit, a contrite heart being delivered from guilt. The entire chapter speaks of confession, of testifying about the pains of life, of telling your story. A clean heart, a renewed spirit, God will freely give it. But it requires something of us too. It means no more secrets, no more holding your story inside. Because secrecy is the enemy of our souls. Secrecy is the enemy of our souls. The Bible confirms this. If we think of the beginning of the entire story, right, with Adam and Eve, what did they do when they messed up? It tells us in Genesis 3. Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God. They hid. They tried to keep it a secret. And I believe that was just as much their demise as was eating that fruit. Because we know God is merciful. We know he's a loving God. We know he desires to have a relationship with us, intimacy with us. What if, instead of hiding in secrecy, Adam and Eve instead ran to the Father. They ran to find him. They fell at his feet and they begged for his mercy and they confessed it all. What if they'd done that? What if they'd told their story? Now, there is no way to know. But I think we'd have a lot skinnier book. There are people who need your story. Professing your story, sharing your testimony could be the key to releasing someone else from the prison and the bondage of their past. But how do I do that? How did my mother do that? Well, the part of my mom's story that I haven't told you yet is that she, like many, struggled after the war. Memories of death and bombings and hunger and destruction and the very real fear of being called out and sent to her death for defying the Nazis. It all haunted her. Her family was broken. Her country was broken. She was broken. Until a traveling preacher came to town. And he talked about Jesus in a way she'd never heard before, about how he could heal her heart, forgive her past, and give her a purpose and a resolve to carry on. But in order for him to take those burdens from her, she had to be willing to hand them over, to not cling to them as her identity. Before she could find the courage to tell me or anyone else her story, she had to tell it to God first, to lay it before him with all its ugliness, to confess her wrongs, to confess with her mouth that Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead so she would be saved. For with her heart she believed and was justified, and with her mouth she confessed and was saved. Belief and salvation, it doesn't just happen in here. It also happens here. Something happened in my mom that day. Was her family still broken? Yes. Was her country still broken? Absolutely. Was there still immense national shame? Oh, you bet there was. Her circumstances, they didn't change. But something inside her did. Healing began, and a little bit more of the burden was lifted every day. And she had hope. That feeling of freedom, of release, there's nothing else like it. I've experienced it myself. You see, I had a secret once. Even though my childhood pales in comparison to the trauma my mother experienced, I had a lot of wounds that I kept hidden inside. And the longer they stayed in there, the more they festered. And when we don't deal with our trauma, our past, it has a way of coming out sideways, doesn't it? We find unhealthy ways to cope with those haunting thoughts, those insecurities, the guilt. For some, it might be bursts of anger, lashing out at people around you. For others, it's alcohol or drugs, maybe seeking the next thrill, the next escape. For me, the way I coped was an eating disorder in my early 20s. I felt like I couldn't control the circumstances around me, but I could control food. That is, until it controlled me. But I kept it a secret. And with each passing day, I became more consumed in my behavior and more desperate. And eventually, I couldn't understand why I couldn't just eat like a normal person. I would wake up every single day thinking, today is the day. Today is the day. I am not going to do this anymore. But the day became just like every other day. And week and months and years. I felt so hopeless, so full of despair. I did pray to God. I said, God, please, please, God, just let me die. I don't want to do the job myself. It had come to that. I came to a place where I knew I needed help and that my very life depended on it, that I could not fix myself. But it required something of me that terrified me. It meant I had to tell my story, to tell the secret. And so with fear and trembling, I confided in someone I trusted, my older sister. And I said the words out loud for the very first time ever. I'm bulimic. And she embraced me with no condemnation and just held me. And it was such a release. And if I could tell her, maybe I could tell someone else, someone who could help me. And so I sought counseling. And I met a girl in my group therapy who invited me to her church. This church. Now, I had grown up going to church every Sunday, every Wednesday. Every time those doors were open, my family was in that church. And I had heard about Jesus and love and mercy my whole life. But when I came to this church, Jesus became real. And so did his grace. And in a moment of surrender, I did what Adam and Eve should have done. I ran to God to the foot of the cross. I fell at his feet and I spilled all my junk on the pavement. And something happened, and I've never turned back. Now, that doesn't mean my life has been void of hurt and heartache or sin, if you only knew. But he's been there alongside me. And I can look back on my story now, and I praise God for it. I can see that redemptive path. In fact, that girl who invited me to church, she's still my dearest and closest friend to this day. We have gone through so much of life together, and I would have never met her had I kept my secret. I would never be a part of this church body had I kept my secret. My story's not over. If it were, I wouldn't be before you today. And my mom's story, even though she's not here anymore, it's not over. It's being shared around the world. And Jimmy's story, despite its tragic end, despite him being gone 80 years, in some ways, his story is just beginning. It's not over, and neither is yours. Tell your story. My mom's story brought healing and closure to a family an ocean away and decades later. And I hope my story has brought a bit of healing and hope to someone today, too. Your story can do the same. Your story can be redeemed, but it has to be told. I can't tell you how many people come up to me after hearing about my mom, and they say, I wish I'd asked my grandma or my dad or my mom about their life growing up. But now it's too late. Do not make your children or your grandchildren someday say, I wish. Tell them. Tell them. And ask others to tell their stories too. You don't have to write a novel, okay? You can just write them down. You can just pull out your phone, maybe even record them, maybe even be really sneaky like I was and not tell your mom you're doing it. You know, this whole thing with the book about my mom, it started off as a personal project to capture her memories. I did it for my family and my friends and to preserve her legacy. I never imagined in a million years that it would span the globe, that I would be hearing from readers around the world on 6 continents, or that I'd speak at more than 80 events in the last year or so, including speaking to you today. Never in a million years. And please don't ask me how it happened. I had no idea what I was doing. I still have no idea what I'm doing, okay? I had no plan. But someone did. And I told God that if a door opened, I'd walk through. But he didn't open doors. He opened the floodgates. He has done exceedingly abundantly more than I dared to ever hope or imagine. And I couldn't have orchestrated this if I tried, and none of it would have happened had my mom not told her story. Amazing things happen when you tell your story. Do you remember Catherine, Jimmy's niece? I met her this past summer. She and her husband Ron drove all the way from Mississippi, and they brought all of Jimmy's things from the war in a cedar trunk. In fact, his whole life is in that trunk. Everything from his baby book and Boy Scout pin to his uniform and every letter written from the war, the official telegram that was handed to his mother and father, telling of his death. And I imagined the tears wept over it. When Catherine and I dragged the trunk into my living room and she opened it, the first item she pulled out was a book. My mom's book, Waltraud. She placed it in there saying, that's where it belonged now, because it finally brought closure to Jimmy's life, to Jimmy's story, and to her family. My mother's story was the only story on the entire planet that could have brought that healing. What if she never told it? And what if you never tell yours? Who are you withholding healing from? Will you do something for me, for yourself, and just as importantly, for others? Tell your story. You can start today, and you can tell it to Jesus right now in your heart. You can ask him to heal the broken parts of your story. And I'm going to give you a moment of silence right now to do that. And now that you've told Jesus, tell others. Because there is someone on the other side of your silence who needs the healing only your story can bring. Thank you.
Just hang a minute. And then they're going to want to share their appreciation.